In a deep cave, Jesus and his disciples sit in profound silence, experiencing the echoes of their thoughts. Little do they know, this silence holds the key to mastering the inner noise of the mind. It was a time of great challenge for Jesus and his disciples. The demands of the crowds, the opposition from the Pharisees, and the constant travel had begun to weigh on them. The disciples, though devoted to their teacher, often felt overwhelmed by the pressures of their mission. Each carried their own burdens, some worried about their families back home, some about their future, and others about their place in this divine journey with Jesus. The tension had been building for days. The journey had been long, the roads dusty and difficult, and though they followed Jesus faithfully, doubt and weariness had crept into their hearts. They often spoke amongst themselves in hushed tones, questioning what was to come. Were they strong enough for the path ahead? Could they truly live up to the calling that had been placed upon them? Sensing their unrest, Jesus decided it was time for a retreat. He needed to teach them something that could not be learned in the chaos of the crowds or the streets of the cities. They needed to experience a deeper truth, something that could only be understood in the silence. And so, one evening as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Jesus called his disciples together. "Come with me," he said, his voice calm yet filled with purpose. "We are going to a place where we can listen, truly listen." The disciples followed him, leaving behind the noise of the village, the demands of the people, and the distractions of their worries. They walked in silence, the only sound being the crunch of their sandals on the rocky ground and the soft rustling of their robes in the cool evening breeze. The landscape became more rugged as they climbed, the air crisp and still. The further they walked, the more distant the world seemed, as though they were leaving behind everything familiar to venture into something unknown. After what felt like hours of walking, they arrived at the mouth of a great cave. Its entrance was wide and foreboding, a deep, dark hollow that swallowed the last of the daylight. The disciples hesitated for a moment, unsure of what lay ahead. The cave seemed both inviting and intimidating, as though it held secrets they were not yet ready to uncover. Jesus entered first, his figure disappearing into the darkness. One by one, the disciples followed him, their hearts beating a little faster as the cave enveloped them. Inside it was cold and vast, the walls towering high above them. The air was thick with silence, so quiet that even the slightest sound seemed to echo endlessly. The disciples settled onto the stone floor in a circle around Jesus, their breaths shallow, their thoughts racing. They were used to the open spaces, the fresh air of the countryside, the bustling crowds. This place was different. The silence here was heavy, almost oppressive, as if the cave itself was watching and waiting for them to speak. For what felt like an eternity, no one said a word. The silence grew louder with each passing moment, filling the space between them, amplifying their thoughts. The longer they sat, the more uncomfortable they became. Their minds, no longer distracted by the outside world, began to churn with thoughts they had been avoiding, fears, doubts, anxieties about their mission, their futures, their families. Peter, always the boldest among them, was the first to break the silence. He shifted uncomfortably on the cold stone, his voice echoing through the cave as he spoke. "Master, why have we come here? What is there to learn in this emptiness?" Jesus, seated calmly in the center of the circle, looked at Peter with a knowing smile. "Peter," he said gently, "do you truly believe this place is empty?" The disciples exchanged puzzled glances. What else could this dark, hollow cave contain but emptiness? "Listen," Jesus said, his voice soft but commanding. "Listen carefully." The disciples fell silent, straining their ears to hear something, anything, in the darkness. And then they noticed it, the faint echo of Peter's voice still bouncing off the cave walls, long after he had spoken. It was as if the cave itself had taken his words and thrown them back, slightly distorted but unmistakably his own. "Do you hear it?" Jesus asked. "The cave does not speak on its own. It only returns what we give it." Thomas, the most skeptical among them, frowned. "But Master, it's just an echo," he said. "It's nothing more than the sound of our voices coming back to us. What meaning can we find in that?" Jesus smiled, patient and wise. "Yes, Thomas, the echo is your voice. But have you ever thought about what this means for your heart and mind?" The disciples sat in silence once more, pondering his words. They had followed Jesus for many months, had seen him perform miracles, had listened to his parables, yet each new teaching left them with more to consider. This lesson, however, was unlike anything they had heard before. Jesus stood slowly, the torchlight flickering across his face, casting shadows on the cave walls behind him. "Let me tell you a story," he said, his voice filling the space, capturing their attention. "Once there was a young shepherd who lived in a small village surrounded by mountains. He was a good man, gentle and kind, but his heart was troubled. His mind was always filled with noise, worries about the future, fears about his responsibilities, and doubts about his place in the world. Though he lived a simple life, his mind was never at rest. He longed for peace, but no matter how hard he tried, he could not silence the constant chatter in his head. One day, overwhelmed by the noise of his thoughts, the shepherd decided to leave the village and seek peace in the mountains. He climbed higher and higher, leaving behind the people and the noise of everyday life. He believed that if he could just find a place of complete silence, he would finally be free of his worries. After many hours of climbing, the shepherd came upon a cave much like this one. Exhausted, he entered, grateful for the shelter. The cave was silent. No wind, no birds, no people. It was the quietest place he had ever been. He sat down, closed his eyes, and waited for the peace to wash over him. But as the minutes passed, something strange happened. The cave was silent, but his mind was not. The noise inside his head, the worries, the fears, the doubts, only grew louder. Without the distractions of the outside world, the noise within him became deafening. The shepherd began to panic. He had come here for peace, but all he found was more chaos. The disciples listened intently, their own hearts resonating with the shepherd's struggle. Each of them had felt the same at some point on their journey. Moments when the noise of their thoughts became overwhelming, moments when the silence of the night brought no peace, only fear. Jesus continued, his voice calm, yet filled with emotion. The shepherd, in his despair, began to shout. He called out to the cave, hoping that anyone would hear him. But the only answer was his own voice, echoing back at him, louder and more distorted. Every cry, every fear, every doubt was thrown back at him by the walls of the cave, magnified and relentless. The more he shouted, the louder the echo became, until it felt as though the cave itself was mocking him, trapping him in his own fears. The disciples shifted uneasily, the weight of the story pressing down on them. They could feel the shepherd's desperation, his hopelessness. How many times had they too felt trapped by their own thoughts, their own doubts? But then, Jesus said, his voice softening, something changed. The shepherd, exhausted from his cries, finally fell silent. And in that silence he began to notice something. The echo, which had seemed so loud and overwhelming, had faded. The cave was no longer amplifying his fears. In the stillness, the shepherd realized a profound truth. The cave was not creating the noise. It was only reflecting back what he had given it. The more he shouted, the more the cave echoed. But when he was still, the cave was still. The disciples sat in stunned silence, the weight of Jesus' words sinking in. The cave, like the mind, was not the source of the noise. It was merely a mirror, reflecting back whatever was placed inside it. The lesson was clear, yet deeply challenging. The shepherd, Jesus continued, began to understand that peace could not be found by escaping the world, by running to the mountains or hiding in caves. True peace came from within. It was not the silence around him that mattered, but the silence within his own heart. The more he calmed his mind, the quieter the cave became. And in that stillness, he found the peace he had been searching for. As Jesus finished the story, the cave once again filled with silence. But this time the silence was different. It was no longer oppressive or heavy. It was filled with understanding, with the deep, resonant truth of Jesus' words. John, who had been sitting quietly, his heart heavy with emotion, finally spoke. His voice was soft, trembling with the weight of his own fears. "Master," he said, "I am like the shepherd. My mind is always filled with noise, and sometimes I feel as though I cannot escape it. Even when I try to focus on your teachings, the doubts and worries keep coming back. How do I find the peace that the shepherd found?" Jesus turned to him, his eyes filled with compassion and love. "John," he said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, "the noise of the world is always with us. We cannot silence it completely. But what we can do is learn to control the echo within our own minds. The world will always be loud, but the true battle is within your heart. The cave, like your mind, will only echo what you give it. If you fill it with fear, with doubt, with anger, that is what will return to you louder and stronger. But if you fill it with love, with peace, with faith, the echoes will be gentle, and you will find the stillness you seek." Tears welled up in John's eyes as he nodded, the truth of Jesus' words resonating deeply within him. The other disciples too were moved. Each of them had been struggling with their own inner noise, their own fears and doubts. And now, for the first time, they saw that the power to control that noise lay within themselves. Jesus stood once more, his presence commanding yet filled with a gentle strength. "My friends," he said, "the mind is like this cave. It will echo whatever you put into it. If you give it fear, anger, or doubt, that is what will return to you, amplified and overwhelming. But if you give it love, peace, and faith, the echo will be soft, and you will find the stillness you seek. The world cannot silence the noise for you, but you can master the echo within your own heart." As Jesus' words echoed through the cave, the disciples felt a profound sense of peace wash over them. The cave, once a place of discomfort and fear, now felt like a sanctuary, a place of deep reflection and truth. They had come here seeking a lesson, and they had found it, not in the silence of the cave, but in the echoes of their own hearts. As they rose to leave, Jesus gave them one final piece of wisdom. His voice was soft, but filled with authority, resonating in the stillness of the cave. "Remember this," he said, "you are the master of your own echo. The world will always be loud, but the noise outside has no power if you find peace within. Control the echo, and the silence will be your greatest strength." The disciples followed Jesus out of the cave, their hearts lighter, their minds clearer. The stars above them shone brightly in the night sky, and though the world around them was the same, something inside them had changed. They had found a truth that would guide them for the rest of their lives. A truth that would help them navigate the noise of the world, no matter how loud it became. As they walked back through the wilderness, each of them carried the same echo within their hearts. A soft, gentle echo of love, peace, and faith. An echo that would guide them through the noise, reminding them always that true peace comes not from silence, but from mastering the echoes of their own minds. This story reminds us that the world may be full of noise, but the true battle lies within. When we fill our hearts with peace, love, and faith, the echoes we hear will reflect those same virtues, leading us to a life of tranquility, strength, and inner wisdom. This is end of the story. Comment Amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.